Well, thank you so much for joining us here today at the Hudson Institute for our event on countering global kleptocracy. I'd just like to say first that it's come to my attention that somebody was taken extremely unwell just before the start of this event, and we wanted just to say that we're extremely concerned about that, and we sort of wish her well and in her recovery, and we'll be trying to find out as much as possible what the developments there are. But just to sort of introduce, sort of after that note, just to sort of introduce myself. My name's Ben Judah. I'm a research fellow here at the Kleptocracy Initiative. My work other half, Nate Sibley, is in the back. And welcome to day 2 of the Kleptocracy Initiative back-to-back sort of bumper events. And I'm really honored to have here really an all-star cast of panelists that I'm going to be moderating here today. Just to introduce them, we have Alexandria Robbins, the Policy Officer, Proceeds of Corruption at Global Witness. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Clay Fuller, the Expert Advisor on Grand Corruption at the International Republican Institute, and James Palmer, Senior Editor at Foreign Policy and author. So just to lay out a little bit how this event will unfold, each of our panelists will talk for 10 minutes, make a presentation on this theme. Then there'll be a moderated discussion amongst the panel, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. So, Alexandra, if you could please go first. So what is globalized kleptocracy?
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for inviting us here today, Ben, and thank you to Hudson for hosting us. My name is Alexandria Robbins. I work for an organization called Global Witness. We have traditionally looked at the life cycle of corruption, so how people get, spend, and keep their dirty money. We're most well known for our in-country investigative work, and it's through those initiatives that we have really seen how the patterns of dirty money flowing into the US and other financial centers has happened. So to answer some of the questions that you alluded to earlier, Ben, in your opening remarks, I think we have to go a few layers deeper to understand the political and policy prescriptions that are appropriate for tackling this financial iceberg. How much money are we actually talking about when we think about the offshore financial system? The Tax Justice Network estimates that somewhere between $7 and $32 trillion exists offshore. Now, I don't know about you, but that gap makes me pretty uncomfortable. We don't know where this money is going. We don't know where it's coming from. And we certainly don't know who owns it, which is a big problem for law enforcement, turns out, because they are operating with one hand tied behind their back. They have very limited tools on what they can do to address this cross-jurisdictional problem. And really, the nature of illicit finance includes layering these jurisdictions to further obfuscate the criminal from the crime. And to make this whole system work, at Global Witness, we think about it as a three-legged stool. So you need a banker, you need an intermediary, and you need a getaway car. So usually that's a corporation, right? Take Mr. Putin, for example. He's conservatively worth around $160 billion, right? He can't put that money in one place, though. He probably also wants a good return on investment. If you take a look at the Cayman Islands for comparative purposes, their GDP is only around $2.5 billion. So theoretically, Mr. Putin could buy the Cayman Islands a few times over, but he would still need to be able to find a place, usually a large financial center, to put the rest of his money. And of course, the ones that come to mind are London, New York, etc. So thankfully, there are some legislative attempts that are kicking around this Congress that help tackle this problem. Our flagship beneficial ownership legislation, of course, but also H.R. 3842, which is the Countering Russian and Other Overseas Kleptocracy Act, otherwise known as the Crook Act. Whoever came up with that acronym should get a medal, because I think it might be the best one in Congress right now. And it establishes an anti-corruption action fund that, again, helps to get at some of this, this overseas cross-jurisdictional money, but also allows for embassy contacts to have anti-corruption connections. And again, having law enforcement be able to talk to each other via the different agencies is critical at this exact moment. Now, the second layer that I want to talk about is figuring out who really owns the wealth that we're mentioning, right? So again, our flagship legislation, the Corporate Transparency Act, HR 2513, was passed out of the House 2 weeks ago. So all eyes are on the Senate. This is the first time that this kind of legislation in 13 years has made it out of a chamber of Congress. In the legislation, is really quite simple. Corporations are the vehicle of choice as a financial getaway car. And the US is a particular problem for this because, honestly, people want to operate in American dollars. When you have a US corporation, it gives you the air of legitimacy. And the bill, at the end of the day, only requires 4 pieces of information, which most of us should know off the top of our head. Your name, your date of birth, address, and ultimately an identification number. So something like a passport, driver's license, something that proves who you are, who you say you are. And then it's a unique bill in the sense of the support that it's garnered. All sides of the aisle, the administration, national security groups, good government groups, virtually the entire financial services industry, you really name it. And I think it does speak to the sense of this broad coalition that we've brought together and that there are real implications for this issue that we see on a daily basis. And finally, this is the last piece of the puzzle that I think Hudson has had a lot to say about, but those are the professional enablers. So the people who make big business out of importing corruption and supporting authoritarian regimes and ultimately peddling influence. Again, going back to our analogy of the 3-legged stool, the sticking point here is that the lawyers, the accountants, the lobbyists, financial advisors, and to a certain extent, real estate agents, none of them are legally required to ask the hard questions about who we are doing business with. And the most outstanding point of all of this is that even in some of these professions, you actually have to take an oath, right? And I understand not everybody's moral compass points north, but I'm going to let you draw those conclusions yourself. And in 2016, we actually did an undercover investigation along with 60 Minutes, where we went into 13 very premier New York law offices and posed as an advisor to an African oil minister. And let me tell you, this person should have set off every single red flag in the book. You know, they said, my boss makes a teacher's salary, but I need to bring it into the US, millions of dollars, and it needs to look squeaky clean, and my name can't be anywhere on it. Can you help me? And every single lawyer, except for one, said that they could, including the former president of the American Bar Association at the time. So, again, I'm out of time here, but the last thing I'll say is that ultimately corruption is a human story. And I think it's important that we root this debate in the tangible. So let's take the TJN number, the low end, the $7 trillion that's parked offshore. And let's say we pass beneficial ownership legislation, it gets enacted into law, and we start having a directory that collects this. And let's say it largely fails, right? We only get 10% of that money that's sitting offshore. That's $700 billion, which is about how much we spend on every single child in America from kindergarten to their senior year in high school. So again, this has real implications for average, everyday people. Law-abiding citizens across the globe are getting screwed by the mega wealthy and the kleptocrats of the world. So I will stop there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We just want to say kind of thank you to Global Witness for being such a leading force on this issue. Clay Fuller.
Yes, thank you. So thank you, Ben. Thank you, Nate, and the Kleptocracy Initiative at the Hudson Institute. Been on the advisory council for the past 2 years now at the Kleptocracy Initiative. During those 2 years, I was also a Jeane Kirkpatrick Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where I was part of the inaugural class of these fellows brought in to bring academics out of academia and into the policy world to let them get their feet wet and introduce their ideas. Now what I'm doing is I'm an advisor for the International Republican Institute on grand corruption issues surrounding that and other issues surrounding democracy promotion. I'm also an adjunct professor at Western Carolina University for the past 6 years, where I've been teaching about international relations and American government. But I'm here today in mostly my personal capacity and my capacity as a political scientist. So I have sort of 3 different perspectives on all of this. You can read a lot of my writings. They're still up on the AEI website, or visit my profile online. There's all the writings are out there. But check out all that. But I have 3 basic perspectives. One as the political science perspective, one as an American citizen concerned about my country and freedom in the world, and then another as a Texan. I am a native Texan, and I have very strong views about independence and privacy and things like that Texans really care about. So starting off with, as a political scientist, the research is very clear on all of this, right? So if you look at the different scholars out there who've been studying this, collecting the data, writing about it, every single war involves an authoritarian regime. They're the worst human rights abusers around the world. They rank among the most corrupt around the world. They are the least transparent. They foment things like genocide, famines, poverty. Everything bad you can really imagine in the world somehow emanates from non-democratic regimes around the world. And we have all the evidence in the world. So I'm not a historian, I'm not a philosopher, I'm more of a data scientist, right? So I look at empirical, I'm a science nerd. Right, so I look at the scientific method. How do we understand these things? And this is the conclusion that I've come to after earning 4 degrees in political science. Yes, I have 4 degrees. Don't do it. But I am a nerd, right? So this is what we found in the literature. Also for regime transitions, right? So if you look at regime change as it changes in non-democratic regimes, the most common regime transition is from one authoritarian type to another authoritarian type. It's not transitions to democracy, and it's not breakdowns of democracies. The churning is all going. It's just a military regime is becoming a personalist regime, is becoming a party regime. That's what's happening with authoritarians. Now, in my academic research, when I was writing, I'm hoping to turn this into a book at some point, I looked through the data and I studied leader survival and regime survival. So basically how long, using data and methods to predict how long a dictator will stay in office or how long a modern authoritarian regime will last. And on the leader side of it, I used the Varieties of Democracy data set, which is this great data set out there with their measures on corruption and executive embezzlement. And what I found using duration models or survival modeling, econometric methods, I found that the best predictor of how long a modern dictator will stay in office is how much he embezzles while there. And so essentially, the more you steal while in office, the longer you stay there. Now, separating that out from the regime, modern authoritarian regimes, what I did was I went and collected original data on foreign trade zones, which are called special economic zones or free trade zones in other places, and sovereign wealth funds, which, if you'll recall, was involved in the 1MBD scandal in Malaysia. And I found that these largely Western-connected liberal economic policies were the best predictor of how long a modern authoritarian regime will survive as a regime, right? So it's basically like a theory there, right? The leader steals and then invests the money through these vehicles in the West. And that's how modern authoritarian regimes become stronger, more durable, and survive into the future, right? So when I came out here to DC, it became like, well, okay, how do I take this abstract academic work that I'm doing that very few people are reading and turn that into policy, right? Or not turn it into policy, but connect it to what's going on. And so I started looking around, and this is when I stumbled on the whole beneficial ownership debate that has been going on for well over a decade throughout all the time I was doing all this research, and saw, well, that's exactly what this is about. And so this gets to the second perspective as an American citizen. Right, so look, I get it. The Iraq War was a big blow to our self-confidence as the world's premier democracy, right? There has been a huge introspective wave of isolationism and looking within ourselves since the Iraq War to try and decide, what is democracy? Is it good for the world? Is it, I get it. I've been through the whole thing too, but it's about time to start getting our self-confidence back, right? And so this is what I've been talking about and working on now is that democracy needs to get its groove back, essentially. We need to get the self-confidence back to be able to talk to the world and explain to them why democracy is good, why democracies are more transparent than authoritarian regimes, why authoritarian regimes are more corrupt than democracies are, and get back to the basics of learning about how all this works. Now, on the war part, right, so democracy promotion, right, there's been a conflation about whether democracy promotion is promoting regime change or something like that, conflated in with the Iraq war. And I would just want to state very emphatically that that's not what democracy promotion does, right? People who believe in democracy and support it don't wage war. That's what militaries do, right? Which, by the way, it was our awesome military, yes, that went into Iraq, but our military was led by a democratically elected president, which, by the way, is one of the defining features of any democracy around the world, that it's a civilian-led military that commands the military. And the other point is that whether we like it or not, America promotes democracy around the world just by simply existing, right? Our country was founded by a group of people who came over here and were angry at dictators stealing their stuff, and emphatically wrote a constitution and rules and set up a system because they were mad about authoritarian governments taking all their stuff, right? So we need to get back to sort of remembering that, and that's how I perceive a lot of global kleptocracy in this issue as an American citizen perspective, moving away from the academic side of it, political scientist. Finally, as a Texan, right? And I was born and raised in Texas, love the state, native there, and I have all the weird eccentricities that are attributed to most Texans. But one of them is that I don't like government control. Right? Texans are fiercely independent. They're very not trusting of government in any form, anywhere, really. But so this gets to the sort of, when I came to the beneficial ownership issue, right? This is giving over information to the government to protect us internationally, right? A lot of people, my friends, would come to me and ask, how in the world can you be on board with that? Like, I know you. That's not what you believe in. And I would say after 2 years of really digging through this, reading everything about it, studying it intensely, I have no reservations about this. We give way more information to the government on a regular basis for all this. So we can go into like I think we will go into sort of the differences between FinCEN and the IRS, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and then the international bodies like the Financial Action Task Force and how that's related to the Group of Seven. And I have a lot of ideas and things we can talk about that, but there's no reason to be apprehensive about this issue. It's purely a national security issue. It should be treated as such and used to promote American values at home and abroad.
Thank you so much, and thank you again for being such a firm friend of KI. And being on the advisory council. Now, sort of last but not least, James Palmer. And I'd almost like to ask you a question. In fact, I'd actually like to ask you a question, which is, how does China come into this frame of kleptocracy? Do we need to adapt it?
So the model that we have for tackling kleptocracy, or the model that's emerging from these discussions, is one that's been very geared towards weak states or failed states, one that tends to see dirty money as tied around individuals and their power. In Russia's case, we're seeing more of that kind of coincide with the state because that corrupt elite is so controls the reins of power in Russia. But in China, it's a very different question, because it's true that this dirty money exists. It's true that this kind of kleptocracy in this classic state sense exists, where there are people who have stolen a bunch of money and want to get it out of the country, want to get it to the West, want to buy influence for themselves in other countries. But they are the weakest and the most endangered part of kleptocracy in China. The actual threat, the biggest threat, is the party state itself and the way in which the party state has transformed itself into a vehicle for a very small number of people at the top to make enormous amounts of money for themselves and their families, but much more influentially for us, to use both legitimate and illegitimate forms of power and money to try and influence global affairs and Western politics. So the models that we've built up are useful for tackling this kind of petty kleptocracy, but they start to become weaker, and well, we have to find different ways of tackling the challenge when it comes to dealing with the biggest threat, which is the party state itself. So I spent 15 years in China. I still don't really know why. I just sort of ended up there in 2003 and stuck around for a while. Most of that time was in Beijing, though a lot of it was traveling around the provinces. And what living in Beijing as a foreigner with all that unusual access gets you is a dual sense of the influence and the power of corruption. Because on the one hand, I was going to places like Sichuan after the earthquake, where I was seeing the literal erosion caused by corruption. These foundations built in schools that had been built of shoddy materials so that the money could be stolen by the construction magnates. I mean, savings of a couple of $1,000s on a school that would then collapse in an earthquake because the foundations were, the Chinese say, like tofu. I was going to Tianjin, where the lack of oversight and regulation, the endemic corruption in the warehouse industry produced an explosion that killed somewhere between 800 and 5,000 people. We still don't really know how many because it was so systematically covered up after the event. Not really covered up, it's very hard to cover up an explosion that takes out a city block, but it was no longer permitted to be talked about. It had an existence of a few days in the media and then disappeared. But at the same time, I was spending a lot of time with the Chinese rich, and I saw the sort of rise and fall of this class of petty kleptocrats. Give you an example. I had a friend who was an innocent Texan boy of 40, and he ended up married to a Chinese multimillionaire, basically by chance. So it became very obvious early on that his role in this marriage was to sign a lot of 300,000 euro bank transfers, to occasionally act as a literal bagman of taking, drive out to the Fifth Ring Road, you'll meet a man named Guo with a red tie, give him this suitcase full of cash, this kind of thing. Sometime in 2013, he came home from work one day to their extremely nice house in central Beijing, which was in itself a replica of an American suburb, down to having a little church in the center, because that's what American towns have. But the church was actually the center of the local party committee. He came home to find his wife feeding documents into a shredder. Turned around and she said, well, I've booked our tickets to the States on Saturday. We're leaving and we're never coming back. He said, what about your son from her first marriage? He doesn't get back till Monday. She said, it's okay. The housekeeper will take care of him. And then he'll come on to America when he can. So she had been caught up in the first stages of the anti-corruption crackdown of Xi Jinping. And literally left with maybe 10, 15% of her money. So you have, and most of China's sort of petty kleptocrats are in that area. They're people who got some money out. They're people who took some money out, but it's nowhere near the scale that they once had. By and large, the anti-corruption campaign and the subsequent measures against money leaving China have been very successful. It's become much, much harder to get money out of China. The cost of money laundering has gone from taking up from about 15% to about 60 or 70%. Going by what the Chinese rich tell me anyway. But at the same time, the ability of the party state to direct dirty money is stronger than ever. To direct the power of Chinese enterprises, to direct the power of Chinese wealth allowed out of the country and guided by the party state. And it's very hard to pin this down exactly because much of this is nominally private. Much of this is nominally individuals or corporations. But there's no company in China that can function without the blessing of the Communist Party. There's no individual in China who can survive, who can stay on the Huan rich list without the blessing of the Communist Party. So without needing anything to be on paper, without needing any explicit command or control, an immense flow of money, of power, of wealth, both licit and illicit, is being directed by a state that is not only authoritarian, it is actively anti-democratic. It sees democracy as a key threat to its own survival. It sees the democratic aspects of the Chinese diaspora as the main threat to its own survival. It sees the existence of American democracy and the idea and the very idea of an open space in which people of Chinese descent can speak as a threat to its own survival. And it's very explicit about this. It lays this out in internal party documents. It lays this out in internal speeches. But the problem is, how do we distinguish the illicit influence? And there's lots of that. There's lots of straightforward criminal or stolen money being directed one way or the other by the party state. And when I say directed, by the way, this is a hugely chaotic and diffuse process. This isn't a clear, organized, top-down effort. This is a bunch of people, all of whom also have their own agendas, their own influence, and so on, but which are working towards the ends that the state has laid out. But then there's also licit money. There's also things like market influence. There's things like Huawei, which is a perfectly legitimate, extremely advanced 5G company that also is fundamentally bent to the interests of an undemocratic state. And that's the point at which these questions, and I think this is a really tricky thing, turn from the sort of technical issues that we've talked about earlier in the conference, we talk about kleptocracy, and turn into political questions, questions of how do we promote and defend our own values? How do we exert a reputational cost for instance, siding with Chinese power? And that becomes really difficult, it becomes really hard. So we can single out the dirty parts of it, we can highlight the dirty parts of it in order to bring attention to how this is part of a whole. But it's just one part of a much bigger set of challenges on the China side that we see to some degree with Russia as well, but much less because there's much less of a clear sense of an organization beyond these individuals, beyond the wealth and power of singular men.
Thank you so much, and thank you for publishing KI in foreign policy. I'd like to sort of guide the discussion now, beginning with you, Alexandria, with this question of we've been on this. I feel that in Washington there's been a journey over the past few years from very little knowledge and information about this issue towards a point where things are moving. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. It's a journey of blood, sweat, and tears to get beneficial ownership this far. I mean, the good news is that we are moving towards a global trend of collecting beneficial ownership information. To give you a sense about that, I mean, the UK has now had their public beneficial ownership registry directory up for the last couple of years. We've done a comprehensive analysis of that and found some interesting tidbits, which I can get into later. But now the 28 EU member states are having to create public beneficial ownership registries. And the UK has now asked their overseas territories and crown dependencies. So these are the most notorious dark havens for money that exist. Again, Caymans, BVI, et cetera. they are now going to have public beneficial ownership registries. Afghanistan, for instance, is setting up a beneficial ownership registry. So the good news is that the trend is there. The bad news is that if the US does not do it, if we do not pass this law immediately, we are risking signaling to the rest of the world that we are open for the world's dirty business, and that's not something we want. So.
And in Washington, how has this coalition been assembled? What's the journey been here? What's brought these groups together?
Sure. So by trade, I'm an organizer. I've talked to people all over the country about this issue. And I think it is, I mentioned earlier a little bit of the strange coalition of bedfellows that we've created. It's not every day that you have Dow Chemical and Earthrights on the same side of the issue. Same with us and ExxonMobil, for instance. So I think it's a lesson to take away for other campaigns, which is that you have to be willing to have the hard conversations with people that you might not always think are going to be your allies. And that has gotten us extremely far. The FACT Coalition has done a ton of work to bring us this close. And I think the Senate is moving ahead. All eyes are on the Senate Banking Committee, and it's really up to them at this point to move the legislation.
Thank you. Clay, I'm fascinated by viewing this issue through a national security lens. And I'd really like to ask you, what would need to be done to create a US anti-money laundering system that began to look like a shield against financial corruption or financial warfare? Where would we even begin? What would we have to do institutionally beyond beneficial ownership?
Well, so you've been in DC long enough when you can say, I wrote a report on that. Right. So I wrote this report for the American Enterprise Institute on dismantling the authoritarian corruption nexus, which I sort of laid out a bunch of these kind of ideas, and I think that's the perfect question that we should be thinking about. Essentially, the way I've seen it as an academic looking at this stuff is that, like FinCEN, like our institutions, our existing institutions that we have, just need better direction. Like, we have all the nuts and bolts in places. We have all the things, like, America's built for this. Like, we're already set up for it. We just need the leadership and the sort of direction on where to go. So, for instance, FinCEN, which is a financial crimes enforcement network, is part of the US Treasury, could use, some better language in its mission statement on looking at authoritarian states in particular as the threat that they are. I mean, in the event yesterday with Nate and Josh Rudolph from the German Marshall Fund, we're talking about authoritarianism. Authoritarian corruption is essentially the new communism. And I would agree with that. It's just that authoritarian corruption is non-ideological. It's just basic nuts and bolts economics. So our existing institutions, we just need to reorient them towards authoritarian corruption, explain what this is to the professionals and the experts there, and say, this is what you're looking for, this is what you need to go do. And one way you do that is with a national security policy or a national security plan, strategy. With that, you can lay all that out, and then the American system will go to work doing its job, putting dictators out of business. And then from an international standpoint, the group of seven, right? So getting back to the research on democracies and how this works internationally, I've always looked at the group of seven as being a perfect starting point for sort of reinvigorating democracy around the world. Because all seven of those nations are the world's longest standing, most durable capitalist democracies that have ever existed on the planet. So there's natural room for cooperation there to grow out into this. And with the G7 also, the G7 created in 1989 the FATF, which is the Financial Action Task Force, which is the international norm-setting body on money laundering, anti-money laundering, and countering terrorist financing. They've been hugely instrumental in changing norms and the way that the world has understood, especially countering the financing of terrorism post 9/11. But one issue with that institution is that it's grown very big, very fast, and has not sort of kept to the sort of transparent principles I mean, they state them, but they grew too fast to be able to really spread these norms in an effective way. So there needs to be, in my view, a sort of a recentering. So within the United States, there needs to be a recentering on what the issue is and what the government should be doing about it. And then internationally, there needs to be a bridging back together of United States, Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the democracies of the world, and bring them together to take this on.
Thank you.
Sure, and if I can also just jump in here, I think, Mr. Palmer, you alluded to this earlier, which is that we need some creative legislative problem solving pretty immediately. And thankfully, it starts right here in DC. There are some folks on the Hill who are already trying to tackle this issue. I mentioned the Crook Act earlier, which is an idea spun out of the Helsinki Commission, along with illicit cash, of course. That's actually our flagship legislation on the Senate banking side. Then, of course, if you look at Mr. Representative Curtis's office, a Republican from Utah, he's looking at hoping to tackle some of these kleptocratic issues, including the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act and Protecting American Businesses and Persons from Extortion Act. So there are creative legislative solutions that are poking around out there, but they certainly need more groups and more voices behind them, because this is not going to change unless we ask it to change, right? So
I'm just curious to ask you, in terms of the Democratic campaigns, is there any kind of creative problem solving going on there? Like which candidates have policies on this, or where are their absences?
I would love to answer that question. However, I cannot, but if you ask me over a beer, I'll have a
okay.
answer.
Well,
yeah.
certainly will. James, I'd like to bring you into the conversation by asking, what is the Chinese government's calculus of interests on global financial reform? In one side, we hear from Chinese authorities that they want to cut down on corruption, but they operate these major non- or anti-transparent financial centers within their territory. On the other hand, we see, as you sort of pointed out so eloquently, the Chinese weaponizing interdependence and financial flows to exert influence over our own societies. So are there zones for a deal, or is it mostly going to be a zone of conflict with China?
So China has essentially two objectives. It wants to stop its own millionaires and billionaires taking money out of the country, or especially when they go rogue, as it were, and they start to operate as political actors using that money, like Guo Wengui or whoever the hell is funding Falun Gong. Big question. But on the other hand, they also want to strengthen their ties with. They also want to strengthen their ties with corrupt elites in other countries, particularly along the Central Belt and Road route, because that's how they've built up these connections with these countries. So, for instance, we see in Kazakhstan, we see increasingly the Kazakh elite essentially using the Belt and Road, or being seen as using the Belt and Road as a way to get corrupt money out of Kazakhstan, launder it, and bring it back into the West, or even into Kazakhstan itself, without direct connection to them. So China, through the Belt and Road, is almost acting as a kind of global banker for these corrupt elites elsewhere. And it's much more comfortable with the corrupt elites elsewhere, because they're not a threat to the system itself. In fact, they're a wonderful perpetuator of the Chinese system, because they're the most willing to make compromises in order to guarantee their own wealth. So most visibly, both in terms of individual wealth and political stance, why haven't we seen Central Asia or the Middle East take a stand in defense of the Uyghur, their Muslim co-religionists? Why in fact did I think 46 of them sign up to a letter defending China's actions? Because the elites of these countries are so tied into Chinese money, Chinese power. So the problem is, on the one hand, China wants to be able to track and monitor the wealth of its own people, and it sees establishing global norms as part of that. It would like stronger regulation on that. It would like to be able to see where the money of its own citizens is going in the United States and in Europe. But on the other hand, it also wants to, China's overall effort is also an attempt to change the norms and set the norms in a way that defends the corrupt elites of the countries that they do like. So, and we've seen a very deliberate and a very targeted Chinese effort to get people into positions of influence and authority within the UN, within Interpol, within other international groups. I think this is really
the presidency of FATF right now.
Yes, and this is an issue that really has to be decided within each group. I think personally that the US and Europe have an extremely strong interest in keeping China out of that norm setting. I think that the idea that we were going to normalize China, that we were going to effectively cause China to take these rules on itself to become part of the system has been proved largely deluded, and what we've in fact seen is China attempting to rewrite the norms for its own ends. And I think that means that we have to sacrifice opportunities for cooperation that might otherwise exist in order to think on a wider strategic level. But I also think that there's a wide range of debate within there, and there are probably individual areas, narrow and focused things, that where there is opportunity for cooperation, as in other issues. It just has to be, it's just that it can't be thought of as just a question of this thing or this organization or this principle. It has to be thought of on a much bigger strategic scale in terms of how do we deal with the problem of party-state influence.
I think it's an excellent point. One note on that, the Belt and Road, every single point of the road is a foreign trade zone, right? When you're talking about Kazakhstan, that's the largest landlocked free port in the world, which a free port is a foreign trade zone. Special economic zone is the same type structure that I'm talking about with this collecting data and understanding what these things are. So talking about very specific things, that's one area that...
All the way down to Gwadar and,
yes.
Yep. So I would note also on Belt and Road, one of the things that we've seen is a lot of pushback when the Chinese collusion with those corrupt elites becomes a liability for China. So in Malaysia, for instance, with the Malaysian elections, one of the big underlying issues was the feeling that 1MDB, all these scandals were not just a domestic issue, they were also a sense of like the Chinese taking over the country, the Chinese threatening Malaysian independence. And so that's an area where there's a strong tie-up between the interests of the West and the interests of ordinary people in these countries. And those areas, these are countries that still have a lot of civil society, that are quasi-democracies or weak authoritarian states. There's an enormous amount of potential for cooperation there.
So I'd like to bring the conversation back from sort of Central Asia to Washington and to London and Paris and Brussels with this question of the enablers. And I'd like to ask sort of really all of you in turn, like what should we be doing beyond beneficial ownership in order to make sure that our professional classes are not enabling or laundering authoritarian influence and kleptocracy?
Sure. Well, money knows no borders, right? But people do. You have to give law enforcement the tools, but also, I mean, frankly, you have to regulate the enablers. I mean, they have to ask these questions at some point. And right now, I can think off the top of my head, you know, the real estate sector has had a 15-year exemption from the Patriot Act, which had required them to ask these questions. Now, you'd have to ask them how they've gotten that exemption extended for so long, but frankly, I mean, it should be lifted, and we should be looking to other industries as well.
So from a specific standpoint, I mean, there are all sorts of things such as, which I wrote in the report on the Foreign Agents Registration Act, could use another look at how that fits into all this. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, punishing the demand side of bribery to make it, you know, a more level playing field around the world. There's tons of, this is where I get to like, all the like the bits and pieces are in place. We just have to figure out how to use them better. But really from this like professional enablers, from their standpoints, this is where I sort of put on my philosopher king hat and say, you know, this is a question of moral leadership. This is something that you can't really legislate, right? So this is about the professional associations and the leaders of those associations, taking a moral stand and showing leadership and saying this type of behavior is just wrong. It's not American, it's not democratic, it's not the best thing for any of us to be doing. And that's how this changes. That's the legal associations, the money exchanges, the trust managers, attorneys, real estate agents, all that type of stuff. You can't legislate morality, so it's going to have to take convincing the leaders within all these organizations and the leaders in our own government and our own press and everybody to sort of have those difficult discussions and think on this and show leadership.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. James, I'd like to point that question to you, but with maybe referencing some of these cases like what happened with the NBA and what do the enablers mean in the context of a party state with specific ideological objectives as well?
So it means, for instance, that a lot of activities that have become taken for granted in the world of the American elite, like, for instance, quitting a high-level government job and going straight to work for a foreign government, start to look a lot more threatening and a lot more unpleasant than they have done in the past. Because there's no way... the idea of, for instance, a senator leaving his post and then the next year going to work for the Soviet government would have been unthinkable in the 1970s or 1980s. It's the norm when it comes to China. As we've seen recently when, I forget his name, David Vitter, I think, former senator, was caught on tape arguing for Huawei's interests against legislation that he had himself proposed as a senator, while taking very large amounts of money from Huawei and hence honestly indirectly from the Chinese government. I think we see it with people like, I'm going to be extremely indiscreet here and look at, say, somebody like former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, now in an extremely prominent role at the Asia Society, whose daughter is a brand ambassador for Tencent in Australia, and whose brother runs a consulting firm dealing with Chinese interests in Australia. We've taken for granted this tie-up of elite interests that allows people to work for agencies of an authoritarian state or to work for companies that are increasingly, obviously, just arms of an authoritarian state. And I'm going to disagree a little bit here and say that I think we can legislate morality in some cases, and I think that one of the simplest things we could do is say that if you hold a government position and a position in a government agency past a certain level, you cannot work for a foreign-owned company or a foreign government for X number of years. I think that would, in and of itself, create a serious blow to the types of influence that not only China but also states like Saudi Arabia run in DC. It would also be extremely hard because lots of people, for a lot of people, this is basically their retirement plan. And what I think we can do is start imposing much greater reputational costs for this kind of activity. And I think that, I'm sure that a lot of people here are from the glorious world of think tanks. And let's be honest, a lot of think tanks take foreign money. A lot of think tanks either take foreign money directly, or they take foreign money through intermediaries, or they take money from people who have very strong business interests in those countries. And sometimes that's perfectly legitimate. Sometimes these countries are America's allies. Sometimes, the German Marshall Fund has German right there in the name, but nobody sees Germany as a threat.
For the record, the American Enterprise Institute has a stated policy that they take no money from no government anywhere.
It's a good policy, but I think that we should start. I think that we should start questioning why this money is taken. I think that think tanks should start becoming a lot more skeptical about how they take this money. And I think that we should start calling these things out by name much more publicly rather than just having them be part of sort of the DC whisper channel.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. And now it's a chance to hear from our esteemed audience. I'm going to be asking kind of questions in a selection, gather a couple, and then present them present them to the panel. So don't be shy. Put up your hands. The gentleman in the fine pink shirt.
Yeah, so I have a question regarding.
Could you please just introduce yourself,
Sure,
where you're from, just yeah.
Sure, my name's Azim Ibrahim. I'm a director at the Centre for Global Policy here in Washington. So my question's around the role of foreign aid as a facilitator of corruption. It seems to me that Western countries, we give a proportion of our GDP as foreign aid to many of these countries that are fantastically corrupt, as David Cameron described them. And we happen to be taking care of many of the needs of some of the poorest in those societies while they are siphoning off huge amounts of money into the West. A good example of this is President Biya of Cameroon, who's also known as President Intercontinental because he spends most of his time in Intercontinental in Geneva. And over half of his country is living below the poverty line. And he's also a recipient. Their country, the poor in the country, are also recipients of huge amounts of foreign aid from the West. So what role does foreign aid actually play in precipitating and encouraging this kind of corruption?
And now the gentleman in the glasses.
To the gentleman in the white shirt.
Sorry?
My question is to the gentleman in the white shirt.
No, sorry.
It's fantastic to hear someone say something about the American political elites behaving now in a way that they would never have during the Cold War, and this is not something that one hears very often. I mean, it's amazing that there is no conversation about the general lack of morality that is agreed upon on a bipartisan level between American political elites after the end of the Cold War. Also, I'm Vladislav Davidson of the Odessa Review. Mm-hmm. I'm from Paris by way of Central Asia and Brooklyn.
Thank you. And a third, yeah, just there. Thank you.
Hi. As an alternative system, I was just curious about perspective for the private network that's evolving in terms of blockchain and cryptocurrencies and the extent to which they can kind of circumvent anonymously, or users can use them anonymously and on a sort of level. So I guess that's my question, whether or not that's being addressed. Is it premature, or thank you.
Your name and affiliation, please.
Pardon me? Oh, my name is Julie Rones. I'm sorry. I'm a consultant and an attorney. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So, would you like to begin?
Sure.
Yeah, or sort of.
So I'm going to table the first two questions because they don't sound as targeted to me. But on the cryptocurrency bit, I mean, as an organization, we are continuing to look at this as something that is a grave concern for us. However, I think there is a little bit of misunderstanding in the public about what blockchain actually is. I won't go into a diatribe about how blockchain actually works here, but it is actually, for many groups, it's a very powerful transparency tool because everything has an audit trail. The ledger, every single ledger is public theoretically. Now, maybe you need a bill longer down the road that says no anonymous Bitcoin wallets. That's a possibility. But it is something I know that the NGO community is looking at very heavily. So,
I can touch on the first and
I'm not really sure which white shirt was the question was addressed to.
Yeah,
but
on the question of foreign aid, yes, this is a huge issue, and Paul Biya has been one of the ones that I've been reading about for a long time, as I'm sure you have too, and it's a great starting point maybe to get a case study going on this. But there's lots of literature. Yes, it's foreign aid is a big problem in all of this. So we need to think more strategically about how this works and how that goes into it. But a lot of the academic literature has shown for a long time that foreign aid is essentially just a bribe for policy concessions, and it rarely achieves the ultimate goals that it aims to. And I don't think that's not to say anything bad about the foreign aid. I mean, I know a lot of people in the foreign aid community, and they're great people, and they have the greatest intentions, and they do wonderful work, and they really do help lots of people. But there's a large, we're on the theme of large strategic issues and questions. I think you hit it on the head. That's one of these many ones, including the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, including foreign trade zones, FARA, all that stuff. On crypto, I have a couple quick points on that, which I mentioned in other stuff. China is planning on creating its own sovereign cryptocurrency. Russia says it's going to. Venezuela tried to and failed twice. Iran says that it's going to. There's talk amongst the non-democracy dictator world about this very intensely, about how to do this, because if they can create their own sovereign cryptocurrencies, which is not an open ledger, which is not transparent, it's a closed ledger so that they can see every single transaction, so they can really track every single nickel if they actually do this. But what it would allow them to do is to transact outside of the US dollar, which would mean our sanctions would not matter at all. They'd have no impact whatsoever. So all of our human rights sanctions, all of our national security sanctions, all that, if they were able to create a network of sovereign cryptocurrencies outside of the US dollar, they'd have no effect on anything, and that would take away one of our strongest non-violent foreign policy tools that we have today. So that's a big sort of threat. And to Alexandria's point, yes, and there are lots of instances. I've been talking with people about the foreign trade zones and trade-based money laundering. There's with the double ledger technology, there's a real opportunity there to invest in this technology and use it as a tool of transparency in the private sector and in the public sector and all around. But it has to have the sort of R&D and the work done really in communicating to the public on what this technology is and how it works.
Can I just ask you to say a little bit more about trade-based money laundering? Because when I look at the figures, and trade-based money laundering is such an enormous proportion of that, I feel that the issue maybe gets slightly under-discussed.
Yes.
And there are not that many kind of obvious solutions to it in the way that sort of ending anonymous companies are. So it's very interesting if you just unpack what you just said
right.
a little bit further. And
Right. So money laundering in general, it takes placement, layering, and then spending it. If you're going to do it through trade, you can do it by obfuscating invoices. Right. So if I'm a trader in one country and a trader in another country, and you want to move money between each other, you can make an agreement to just fudge the numbers on the invoices. And so you can send them $100 million worth of goods, but only invoice it as $1, and then you've transferred $100 million once they sell that good, once it gets into the other country. And so you can transfer money all around the world doing this. And large companies do it to lower their tax burden, to increase efficiency, or to get around corrupt countries that want to look at how much they're shipping in different areas. Terrorist groups use it. The drug cartels use it. Venezuela's using it to move money out of the country. This happens with gold a lot, with changing invoices. Like basically, you take scrap metal and you sprinkle some gold dust on it, and you invoice it as gold and bill it as that, and then nobody inspects it or sees it, and then you transfer that money. Is the proceeds of fentanyl sales or cocaine sales or other things. It's how you move it internationally, and we can't see it, and we don't know. And so this is a huge sort of issue, and it's very complex and big. But so one of the proposals that people have been talking about is this blockchain technology, because there's a chain of command and control there that you can look at, that stays there, and you can verify, which our current model of shipping around the world doesn't have. And this is why I talk about foreign trade zones a lot, because this is where most of this international shipping comes in and out of. There's very specific geographic nodes and areas where we could really put some investment into making them better, giving them technologies, training them in how trade works and how transparency, how all this works, and it would have huge effects on the entire global system.
Just to kind of jump in myself and sort of take advantage of my moderator's position, something that our research here at KI has begun to look at is that all public policy problems at the moment are coming back to issues of information management, data management, and they become very quickly computing problems. Where is all this information going? How accessible is it? Who has access to it? And there is this very positive trend of all these beneficial ownership registers being set up. But what we would like to see is that information being shared coherently between all international governments, being made accessible in formats to law enforcement, and also it will be highly beneficial, we think, if the United States and the UK and the European Union sort of writ large adopted cross-border payments databases, the like of which have been pioneered by Canada and Australia. So I don't know. It's just beginning to look at this. What kind of format, what institutions, what bodies could manage that information, what format it could be shared through. One idea which has been kicked about in France is, could invoicing in general be directed through one algorithm or one format so that governments would know about it? What are the potential pluses and minuses for that? I'd like to come back to you, Jason, to ask you, sort of pin you down, I think, on that point of keeping China out of norm settings. And you seem to be alluding to the idea of trying to prevent the Chinese seizing key positions in the global international organizations such as Interpol. I'd like you to sort of go a bit further and tell us what you mean there, sort of in.
So I mean, I think the truth is that it just means that the US and Europe should use their votes in a concerted bloc against Chinese candidates, that they should work very strongly to influence others against choosing Chinese candidates, and they should point to the existing examples we have of people within those organizations who have fallen victim to the extremely insecure and chaotic party state as examples of why these are not people you want to put in a position of power, not because of any fault of their own, but because they're ultimately, like Soviet diplomats say in the 1930s, subject to the whims and the demands of an increasingly demanding authoritarian master. So we saw this most recently with the head of Interpol literally being disappeared upon his return to China. And this is a situation that we've seen at a much smaller level with things like UN officials and World Bank members who haven't got press about it, but have fallen victim to purges. And that's just even setting aside like the fact that we shouldn't want China to have power or norm-setting power. It's also just an organizational risk for these groups. It's not if you to have your literally the head of your organization disappeared and held without trial overnight because of the politics of his home country does not make for great management.
Mm-hmm.
This is one thing. So I've written about for the National Endowment for Democracy about authoritarian anti-corruption campaigns. And that essentially we shouldn't be fooled by these, because these are power grabs. They're consolidation of power. They're culling the inner elite circles. And so we in the West and in democratic countries tend to hear anti-corruption campaign and think, oh, great, yeah, cleaning things up. But that's not what it is at all over there. And this leads back to like a broader sort of point that the Prime Minister of Moldova recently said, the battle for good governance is an eternal battle, right? And this is what it's about. It's not about arresting people and shows like this. Anti-corruption is about building good governance, right? It's about having transparency, free and fair elections, a functioning market, a government that delivers to you for services like driver's licenses and business licenses without, having to pay a bribe for it. That's what this is all like spins back to.
One of the things, just combining these 2 points, really, this question of data management and information, which I think, blockchain is mostly bullshit. Information, it mostly comes back to the same questions that we have with any information management, which are power and trust. Who holds the power to change things? Who holds who can we trust with the ability to check the information? How do we know that the information was entered correctly in the first place? And blockchain, in almost all practical examples we have, blockchain doesn't really do anything to solve these issues. But it's a lovely buzzword that you can use to get funding, and I would not want to scupper anybody's game there. One of the things we've seen in the Chinese system in the last sort of 7 years or so has been this attempt to replace the kind of functions that you talk about with good governance. So markets, transparency, freedom of speech. It wants the Chinese government very much wants the things that those help produce in the West, like the ability to gather accurate information about what's happening on the ground, like the ability to expose and detect corruption that threatens the state, and for a long time it didn't have that.
Like innovation that comes out of markets and science.
Yeah, it wants the benefits of these, but it particularly wants the benefits of, it particularly wants the ways that these make government cleaner, because it would like to have the party state's ideal would be to have about 500 people on the top making an enormous amount of money and everybody else operating fairly cleanly. And in the 2000s, they thought that they could do this by opening up space for discussion, opening up space for journalism in a limited way, that it wouldn't be allowed to get above a certain level, but that they could create essentially public watchdog organizations that would expose corruption. They abandoned that experiment in about 2010, 2011. And the model they're working on now is something much closer to the sort of Soviet cybernetics of the 1950s or 60s. The Soviet belief was that if they had enough information and enough computing power, they could replace the market. The Chinese belief is that if you have enough information and enough computing power and good enough analysis, you can replace the media and replace the public as watchdogs and be able to see what everybody within your system is doing yourself. Now, it turns out that this, in fact, doesn't work. We've seen in many sectors increased corruption under the anti-corruption campaign, but it's very much like it's the technological dream being sold to the Chinese leadership, and the one that underpins a lot of the talk about blockchain. Which, look, Xi Jinping doesn't understand blockchain. Xi Jinping is 66 years old and and went to college during the Cultural Revolution. He does, however, want control, want power, want to be able to track and process information in a way that keeps it entirely within the state without anybody else involved.
So just maybe to kind of summarize a bit before opening up for another round of questions. It seems from this discussion that there are three maybe action points that we could bring together to develop a really strong national security strategy to deal with the threat of kleptocracy and sort of weaponized financial flows and weaponized interdependence from a party state. The first I'm picking up in is firewalling our institutions, making sure that our institutions our parliaments, our elections, our international bodies are not pay-to-play systems for foreign kleptocrats or agents of the Chinese party state. The second is closing laundromats, making sure there are no getaway cars in the form of anonymous companies or in special trade zones. I think the third element is, I'm picking up here, is screening, making sure that an entity purchasing either the talents of a former Prime Minister of Australia or a large building or a critical industry is not the front for a kleptocrat or one of the tentacles of a political regime with hostile intent. And this point of screening brings us to CFIUS, and I'd love it if you could share your thoughts on this body.
It's a good body. I would say from your, I like the way you've brought this together, but on we're coming up to the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So when you say firewall, that immediately
well, I was sort of picking up on the general computing.
Right. Yeah.
theme
No,
of
I
the
got that.
conversation.
But so the way I think about it is, so I think you're absolutely right on all three of those points. But in the spirit of sort of the Berlin Wall and thinking about all of this as well, there should be an equal focus on tearing down walls. Mm-hmm. And remaining, because there has to be, which I asked a question in the event yesterday about securing America's financial borders, right? What does that look like, and how is that different from China building a great firewall, or Russia walling off its internet, or the Berlin Wall, or anything like that? Like, so we have to be really clear and precise about explaining that, securing America's borders is not about building walls or blocking entrance. It's about creating new processes that will screen out the bad actors, right? But still allow more and more people in. So we always want to, keep a close eye to that welcoming nature,
yes,
of the American system. But yes, screen. I mean, so it's this is where I talk about democracy promotion too. It's about building processes. It's about talking about the process. So we got to focus on new policies, new processes, new discussions, new ways to deal with these new technologies.
And one final round of questions from the person in the front there, and then to the gentleman with this refined scarf there, sort of as number two.
Tying back some of.
And please just introduce yourself and your affiliation.
Well, my name is Erica Espinosa, and I'm from Germantown. When looking for corruption, tying it back to basic microeconomic principles such as the income expansion path and nominal GDP with price and quantity and the different inputs, would you say that would be a good place to look for corruption in terms of it hiding, especially with countries that have low human development indexes? And inflation, of course, and how those two go together.
Thank you. And now the gentleman, first the gentleman with the scarf, and then the gentleman with the pink tie, sort of to round us off.
Good afternoon. My name is Sharif. I do a lot of organizing with the Poor People's Campaign, Sunrise Youth Movement, other groups. A lot of this discussion has been focused on China and how there's a lot of dirty money, coming into the United States, and I agree that's tremendously unethical, and we should do something to stop that. On the flip side, I was curious to hear what you think we can do about American dirty money and the way that our entire tax code and our legal system is essentially rigged so that the biggest corporations are paying nothing in taxes. We're not really getting the deliverables of what government services could look like in America with our tremendous resources. We got 40% of Americans living in poverty. A lot of people are struggling day to day to get by and burdened by tremendous amounts of debt and are trapped in this system. And meanwhile, there's just billions of dollars being being taken out in profits by these mega corporations. And my question is, how do we address domestic kleptocracy? Because the American people are also suffering. And if we want to be a leader internationally, well, we got to do it first at home. We got to set the example. And we got a lot of corruption here that we got to deal with right down the street with Mr. Trump.
Thank you. And the gentleman in the pink tie, and then back to our panelists. Please introduce yourself and your...
Andy Cook from the NCA of the United Kingdom. we've just rolled out another hopefully successful unexplained wealth order, and obviously we're hitting on the Proceeds of Crime Act as well. I would just like your opinion on what do you think the effectiveness of such new policies are going to be, and whether they're exportable to other, i.e., particularly the United States.
Which of those would you like to?
That's a lot of questions to get to. The point on, to answer your question a little bit more directly, I think we have to think a little bit bigger than the microeconomic level here. I mean, just based on our experience in Central and West Africa, I mean, yes, you're right that this has big economic implications, and this is kind of a good segue to talk about your point, which is, I mentioned in my opening remarks how at the end of the day, corruption is a human story. Everybody in this room should go watch The Laundromat. Meryl Streep plays an amazing character where basically she suffers a very tragic loss. And in a story that Global Witness has heard countless times in our report, The Great Ripoff, you can look at more direct examples of how these corrupt vehicles and actors have harmed everyday Americans. I mean, she basically tries to go get her insurance claim for her husband who passed away very tragically. And she can't because that policy was sold and then resold. And she finds herself on a plane to the Seychelles and cannot get any answers. I mean, these stories are rooted in, unfortunately, things that happen to everyday people. And then on the unexplained wealth orders, obviously Global Witness is a huge fan of that tool, and we think that it is a very powerful hammer. Love to see something like that happen in the US, fingers crossed, but it's a little bit different from a privacy perspective. But yes, we are very vocally supportive of that and excited to see where it goes. Yeah.
So for your question, data, yes, always more data. Data is the new gold. I think it's sort of the clarion call for the 21st century. For your question on American corruption, I'm so blessed to live in a country where we can talk about this, right? All these indicators, yes, there are all sorts of problems, right? Huge problems that crush people's lives on a daily basis. After 15 years of studying authoritarian regimes all around the country, they are acutely way worse in all of those states for the people there. Mm-hmm. And half the time, we never hear about all the atrocities because they don't have a free press or free speech to be able to speak about them like we do here. So while I understand the sentiment, I would say, luckily, a year from today, we have an election where we can go to the polls and decide where we're going to go with these issues. And then for the unexplained wealth orders, these are interesting to me. I've been reading about them for a while. It's my understanding, I mean, forgive me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding they haven't really been tested in the courts yet too much. It's still, the norms are sort of developing about it. But when I first read about them, it was kind of like, wow, is that legal? Like, I don't know if, you know,
when a judge issues it, right? I mean, don't get me wrong.
Well, yeah.
The judge has to issue.
I mean, constitutionally legal. Or, I'm not familiar with the British higher court system, mm-hmm. But so it yes, but you know, you come a long way. But it has, I think, it has the potential to possibly be a very powerful tool if used and developed in the right way. But this is something that the British people will have to figure out and yeah.
Yes, I mean, we should note that America has a very long record of taking money from people without asking or checking where it came from. It's just that those people have tended to be poor and black. And if we look at the record, look at how easy it is to strip wealth from somebody traveling with cash as opposed to somebody whose wealth is tied up in stock, that tells you a lot about what the priorities of the American system have generally been over the last 30 years. So being British, I'm simultaneously much more both idealistic and incredibly cynical about American democracy, in that I believe that the ambition of being a city upon a hill is a wonderful thing, and that the American idea that it should stand out as a promoter of democracy and beacon to nations is a good and a fine and a wonderful thing. It would just be very nice if it was actually any good at it at home. And I think that going to this point, not just economically, but in terms of the basic functions of American democracy, in terms of things like gerrymandering and so on, addressing those issues before you, not even before, but simultaneously with promoting democracy abroad, you have to start promoting democracy at home. You can't tackle corruption in the country of Georgia until you've tackled corruption in the state of Georgia. And which of these has the more rigged election system is actually kind of an open question at the moment. So I'd say on data, I think one of the big issues that we've been having is that there are, in the entirety of the United States, maybe a few dozen people who know meaningfully how to read Chinese financial information, who have the combination of the language skills, the cultural knowledge, and by cultural I don't mean like abstract Confucian stuff. I mean like what does Chinese work culture and political culture actually look like, and economic background to be able to accurately trace who owns what in China. And a surprising amount of that information is out there in public in China in various forms. It's just very hard for us to read it. And one of the basic things that America and Europe need to be doing is building up a cadre of Chinese language skills, Chinese language knowledge among the people involved in these kind of international regulations, because it's badly lacking. And in fact, and because we spent the last 10, 15 years teaching all these people to read Russian or Arabic, it's been even more lacking.
Still a need for Russian, I say.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's about all we got time for. Thank you very, very much for just this for letting me gather this extraordinary amount of brain power on one panel. So thank you, Alexandria Robbins, Clay Fuller, and James Palmer. And please, a hearty round of applause.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
No, thank you.